Hey, this is another video from Mr. Mitchell. Today we're going to be talking about European history. You may have noticed the title, European imperialism. Imperialism is a term that we'll learn later on, but it has to do with reaching other countries. Now, we're going to start our experience with European history around the 1400s. You may see we have a 1 through 5 here. This 1 through 5 I'd like for you to write down and take notes on them as we go along. However, ultimately what you'll need to know about European history is the story behind each of these 1 through 5. What do spices have to do with ships? You'll take notes, but you'll need to know the overall story. Same thing with 2 through 5 as well. The ones that we won't have as much on are number 3 and number 4. 1, 2, and 5 will be the most detailed. Well, anyway, let's get started. By the 1400s, merchants traveled across the Mediterranean Sea and did lots of trading by then. Mediterranean Sea, you may remember, is what separates Africa down here from Europe. This is the Mediterranean Sea right here. And if I could draw a good star, that would be better, but we'll just go with that. This is the whole Mediterranean Sea down here. One of the most important items traded was spices. You can see a picture of spices here. But today, spices are not such a big deal. Pretty much everybody has these spices in their cabinets that they never use or very rarely use unless they're doing a lot of cooking. But spices had kind of a different use back in the day of 1400s and 1500s. This was an age before refrigeration, and meat and fish spoiled quickly. So what you could do is take some of these spices like pepper and cinnamon and nutmeg, and you could rub them all over your meat, basically coat them, and it would kind of keep and preserve the meat. And plus it added some nice flavors to it. So spices were much more in demand at the time. And you would have these spice dealers that would be in Asia. Now Asia, they knew could be reached by land, by walking or by traveling horseback, but it took forever. So the most efficient way was by land, was by water, I mean. So these Asia spice dealers would bring spices to ports here in the eastern Mediterranean, and what they would do is then they would sell them to people who were coming in ships to these ports. So there was quite a bit of cost by the time these spices got from Asia all the way around to anywhere in northern Europe, because you had the cost of somebody who's taking the spices all the way there, cost of the ships that were going all the way through the Mediterranean out into the Atlantic. By the time these spices got to anywhere in western and northern Europe, they were very expensive. Inevitably, people started looking for a cheaper way to get their spices and their goods that came from Asia. Could you take a ship and go this way to get to Asia? They knew Asia could be gotten here by foot, and it took a long time, but there was this big unknown that was out here to the west. They didn't know anything about North and South America. They just assumed that if you kept going, you eventually could get to Asia. Also, they knew they had this big landmass down here below them on the map called Africa. Could you take a ship and make it around Africa and eventually come up and get to Asia? There's a lot of uncertainty there, but that was about the time when merchants and leaders started thinking about actually sending people out this way. So that's kind of the story of how spices have to do with ships. Now we're going to talk about number 2. The country that took the lead in sending people out on exploring, and particularly down near Africa, was indeed this little tiny country called Portugal, right here on the Iberian Peninsula. Now we're going to change screens, and I'll circle Portugal again. Portugal again is going to be right here You can see Europe happens to be this area just to the north and east of Portugal, and they happen to be right on the sea. The leader of Portugal was Henry the Navigator, and Henry the Navigator, have a picture of him right here. Now, he was not a seagoing person, but he really thought that using the sea for trade was really the way to go. So he was the one that created a school of sailors in Portugal and sent people to try to go around the world throughout their trading. Now, their scope of the world was kind of limited. I mean, they knew about Europe. They knew there was a big landmass south of them. They knew that there was in Asia. They didn't know anything about all stuff such as this. So Prince Henry sent explorers farther down the African coast, and he hoped that traveling to Asia down the coast of Africa would be a shortcut. And they had some success. They went down and would see where they are, and eventually they were managed to get into this little hook here. And I imagine those people who took that boat excursion might have thought this was Asia, but they kept on going down, and it took till after Henry the Navigator had died before a Portuguese explorer named Bartholomew Diaz, eventually did make it around the southern tip of Africa. Now, as you notice from this world map, the Portuguese explorers are still a long way from Asia. And little did they know that the amount of time it took to get all the way down through here was much longer than it would have been had they gone straight through the Mediterranean, just like Italian merchants had before. But anyway, it would take until Vasco da Gama for Portugal managed to get all the way around and establish ports in India, which is indeed in Asia. But the problem was, it took da Gama 317 days to get all the way from Portugal to India. That's almost a year. Surely there was a better way, thought many merchants. There is a Portuguese sailor of note named Ferdinand Magellan. Ferdinand Magellan and about 200 people took off, and they sailed completely around the world. They ended up going all the way around the south tip of Africa, ended up coming all the way down the south of South America, and made it all the way around the world. Of course, I say that. They circumnavigated the globe. That's what it means to make it all the way around the world. Only 18 of the 200 or more that started the voyage made it, and it took 3 years. But Magellan's crew did it. In fact, Magellan died over here in the Philippine area. But anyway, that kind of concludes the part on Portugal. Let's talk just briefly a little bit about Spain. Now, Spain is this country right next to Portugal here. Later on, Spain would end up having a lot bigger role, but at first, Spain's big claim to fame was Columbus. Christopher Columbus happens to be right here. Henry the Navigator was from Portugal. Columbus, even though he wasn't from there, sailed for Spain. Columbus, instead of taking out south, took out to the west. And indeed, he did end up hitting landfall. He made land at a Caribbean island with his 3 ships. And what was so encouraging when he did that is it only took him 3 months to get to that Caribbean island. Now, of course, he thought he had made Asia. And you see from the world map that he was nowhere near Asia. But he thought he'd made Asia, and it had only taken 3 months in which to do that. So that is probably what got more people to sailing that direction. So that's pretty much it for Spain as of now. Spain will be a big player in imperialism later on. But let's take a look at England here. England is this area right in here. England would also send someone out named John Cabot, and this happens to be John Cabot right here. John Cabot went out west also, and chances are good from what we can gather he ended up hitting Canada around the area of Newfoundland. So that's kind of what England's role happened to be at the time, and this was pretty early. Columbus was 1492 and Cabot was 1497. Magellan and others would be well into the 1500s, even though Henry the Navigator was in the 1400s when he started his school. Now let's talk about the impact of the Europeans. From the explorations of Cabot and Columbus, there was a flood of explorers, especially from Spain and England, that went to the Americas. A flood of explorers. We're not going to dive into every one of them. This is just kind of a quick glance at the exploration era. The countries found many new colonies in North America, South America, and in Africa. Some of those colonies would become countries. This practice of one country controlling the government and economy of another country is called imperialism. And that's what happened here in the United States at one point. Before 1776, the colonies here in the United States were controlled by Britain. We were in Britain's imperialism was actually felt all throughout the world. They even controlled Australia at one point. What happened in most instances of imperialism, it was a clash of cultures. And the lives of the indigenous peoples in the Americas and Africa would never be the same. Many of the conquered peoples of Africa and the Americas were kept as slaves. And without knowing it, Europeans carried diseases with them, like smallpox, malaria, and measles. And the Europeans' bodies had adapted a little bit better to those diseases than North and South Americans and Africans had. The book is going to say that tens of thousands of people died because of these diseases, smallpox, malaria, and measles, that were brought over to the New World. So the impact of people like this and the desire to get spices was just enormous. It affected thousands and thousands of people, and if you look at the names of countries all throughout Africa, all throughout North and South America, they inevitably come from Europe. Look at the languages that are spoken through North and South America. They are languages like Spanish from Europe and Spain, English from Europe and England, Portuguese. Brazil here speaks Portuguese, and it all comes as a result of this era of exploration. Well, I hope you've learned a little bit about the era of exploration and European imperialism.